Picture this, it is 6:30 in the morning. The air is cool enough that I have a mug of coffee wrapped in both hands, and there is fog sitting low over the ridge outside my little rented house in Tagaytay. Somewhere down the road, somebody is sweeping leaves with one of those stiff brooms that makes a scratching sound on the concrete. A rooster has been carrying on since before sunrise. I can smell garlic frying from the house next door. And I am thinking about Australia, not because I miss it. That is the part I have never really said out loud to anybody. I do not want to go back. I am 72 years old. I was born in Newcastle, New South Wales. I worked most of my life as an industrial electrician. And for the first 61 years of my life, I thought I would die in Australia. Not in a dramatic way. I just assumed it. You grow up somewhere, you work there, you marry there, you raise your kids there, and you think the rest of the story has already been decided. Then my wife died. Her name was Margaret. We had been married for 37 years. 37. You hear a number like that and it sounds solid, permanent, like concrete. But there is nothing permanent about a hospital room at 2 in the morning when the person who has been beside you since you were a young man suddenly is not breathing anymore. Cancer took her quickly. 8 months from the first appointment to the funeral. I was 60 when she got sick and 61 when I buried her. After that, I did what men my age are very good at doing. I told everybody I was fine. My daughter would ring me and ask if I had eaten. I would say yes, even when dinner had been 2 pieces of toast. My son would invite me over on Sundays. I would tell him I had things to do around the house. There was nothing to do around the house. I just did not want to sit at somebody else's table and feel like an extra chair. That sounds harsh. My children were good to me. They still are. But grief makes you strange. You can be surrounded by people who love you and still feel like you have been removed from your own life. For nearly a year, I stayed in the same 3-bedroom house Margaret and I had bought when the kids were small. Her gardening gloves were still hanging from a hook in the laundry. Her reading glasses were on the little table beside the lounge. There was a blue cardigan in the wardrobe that still smelled faintly like her perfume. I could not move those things. I also could not keep living around them. The house was not paid off. That surprises some people. They imagine that if you worked 40 years in Australia, you must have everything sorted by retirement. I wish that were true. We had refinanced twice, once to help our daughter through a bad divorce, and once after I had been out of work for nearly 9 months. By the time Margaret died, there was still a mortgage, rates, insurance, electricity, car registration, groceries, and all the little expenses that do not sound frightening individually, but become frightening when they arrive every month. My pension and superannuation were enough to exist. Existing was the problem. I had a notebook on the kitchen table where I wrote down every expense. I stopped buying steak. I canceled a sports subscription. I drove less. I switched insurance. I sold tools I had owned for 20 years. I tried everything before I even considered leaving. That matters to me because people sometimes hear a story like mine and imagine I woke up one morning, watched a travel video, sold the house, and flew to Asia looking for some fantasy. No, I resisted it. I looked at smaller units around Newcastle. I looked farther inland. I talked to a financial advisor. I considered moving closer to my son. I even inspected one retirement village, and I remember sitting in the car afterward with both hands on the steering wheel, staring at the entrance sign. It was clean, safe, organized, and I hated the way I felt there. Nobody had done anything wrong, but I could see the rest of my life being reduced to a smaller and smaller circle, a room, a meal schedule, a television, people checking whether I had taken my tablets. I know, famous last words from an old man who thought he was too independent to need anybody. But what frightened me was not getting old. What frightened me was disappearing while I was still alive. The Philippines entered my life through a bloke named Ron. Ron and I had worked together years earlier. He was one of those men who always seemed to know somebody somewhere. I had not spoken to him in probably 5 years when he sent me a message after Margaret's funeral. He had moved to the Philippines. At first I thought he was joking. He was living in Angeles at the time, and he sent me photos of his little rented place, the market near his street, a plate of food that looked too good for what he said it cost, and a screenshot of his monthly expenses. I told him he was mad. He told me I was miserable. We were both right. A few months later, I started watching videos. That is how it happens. One video becomes 10, 10 becomes 50. Suddenly, you know the difference between Cebu and Iloilo. You are reading arguments between strangers in expat Facebook groups. And you have a spreadsheet comparing rents in places you have never visited. I watched the glamorous videos and ignored them. Beachfront villas, young women, resort pools. Men talking as if they had discovered a secret kingdom where every day was a holiday. None of that interested me. What got my attention were ordinary people. Retired teachers, former mechanics, widowers, divorced blokes in their 60s and 70s, men who talked about electricity bills and visa extensions and where to buy decent bread. Regular people, not rich people. That was reassuring. I came for a 3-week visit before I made any decision. Best thing I ever did. I spent a few days in Manila and knew almost immediately that I did not want to live there. Too fast for me. Too much traffic. Too much noise. Then somebody suggested Tagaytay. The first morning I woke there, I opened the door and felt cool air on my face. That sounds like nothing. After Manila, it felt like somebody had turned the volume down. There were trees, hills, little roadside places selling coffee and fruit. On a clear day, you could look out toward Taal and just stand there for a while. I remember buying a bowl of bulalo at a small restaurant and sitting near an open window while rain started hitting the roof. I had nowhere to be. Nobody needed anything from me. For the first time since Margaret died, that did not feel lonely. It felt peaceful. I went back to Australia and spent another 6 months arguing with myself. My daughter cried when I told her what I was thinking. My son said, "Dad, you don't even know anybody there." That one hurt because he was right. They thought grief had made me reckless. Maybe part of it had. I would be lying if I said Margaret's death had nothing to do with the decision. But grief was not the whole reason. The numbers mattered too. Eventually, I sold the house, cleared what was left of the mortgage, put most of what remained somewhere boring and safe, gave away more furniture than I expected, and packed my life into 2 suitcases. I was 61 years old. One suitcase had clothes. The other had the sort of things you cannot explain to airport security without sounding sentimental. A framed photo of Margaret, a little wooden box my father had made, a folder of family papers, 3 books I had already read. I arrived in the Philippines feeling brave right up until the moment I was alone in the hotel room. Then I thought, Peter, you absolute idiot. I had left my children, my country, my routines, my doctor, my local supermarket, everything familiar. For what? I did not know yet. My first proper rental in Tagaytay was a simple 2-bedroom place on a quiet side road. Nothing luxurious, cream walls, tiled floors, a tiny covered area out front, and a kitchen that looked like it had been designed by someone who did not cook. The rent was 25,000 pesos a month. 25,000. At the time, that felt almost impossible to me because I kept translating it in my head. Roughly 450 US dollars, give or take, and around 680 Australian dollars, depending on the exchange rate. Back home, that kind of money would not have covered much of what my house cost me each month before I even bought food. But cheaper living did not automatically mean better living. That lesson came quickly. I made mistakes. I paid too much for things because I did not know what they should cost. I said yes when I should have said no because I was afraid of looking rude. I trusted one fellow with a small repair job and discovered later that he had charged me nearly double what a neighbor would have paid. Nothing catastrophic, just tuition. You pay to learn a new place. The harder part was learning how not to compare everything with Australia. In Australia, I knew how things worked without thinking. Here, I had to ask, what do I bring? Where do I go? Who do I call? Is this normal? Am I being difficult? There were days I felt old, not physically old, helpless old. That bothered me. Then something shifted. It was not one grand moment. That is important. People like neat stories where one event changes everything. My life did not work like that. It was 100 small things. The woman at the little shop near my house started putting aside the coffee I liked because she knew I would come in. A neighbor named Ernesto noticed me trying to fix a leaking outdoor tap and walked over with a wrench. The family across the road invited me to a birthday meal, even though I had spoken to them maybe 3 times. I got sick once, nothing serious, and before I knew it, there was soup at my door and 3 people asking whether I needed a ride to a clinic. That was when I began to understand the difference between being independent and being alone. I had confused those 2 things for years. Back in Australia, after Margaret died, I protected my independence like it was the last thing I owned. Here, people kept interfering with it. Thank God. They asked where I was going. They asked if I had eaten. They noticed when my gate had not opened by 9 in the morning, they brought too much food. They invited me to things I did not always understand. At first, it annoyed me.
Then it saved me. I still have difficult days. Do not let anybody sell you the Philippines as a retirement paradise where nothing goes wrong. The heat can wear you down when you leave the cooler parts
of Tagaytay. Traffic can test the patience of a saint. Paperwork can be confusing. Things break. Internet goes out. Plans change. Sometimes you're told something will happen Tuesday and discover that Tuesday apparently means sometime before Christmas. You learn to laugh or you become unbearable. I have seen foreigners come here and spend every day complaining that it is not Australia, America, Britain, or Canada. I always wonder why they came. If you need everything to work exactly the way it did back home, stay home. There is no shame in that. But if you are willing to become a beginner again, even at 61, even at 72, this place can give you something valuable. It can wake you up. A few years after I moved, my daughter came to visit. I was nervous. Not because I thought she would hate the Philippines. I was afraid she would look at me and think I had become one of those sad old men running away from his real life. She stayed 12 days. On the 3rd morning, we were sitting outside drinking coffee when Ernesto walked past and shouted, "Peter, your daughter finally came." My daughter looked at me. She said, "He knows who I am?" I laughed. Everybody knew who she was. I'd been talking about that visit for months. Later that week, she met the woman from the shop, 2 neighbors, a retired teacher I played cards with, and a family whose grandson had somehow decided I was his honorary Australian grandfather. On her last night, my daughter cried again, but not like the first time. She said, "Dad, I thought you were alone here." I said, "So did I." That is probably the closest I have ever come to explaining it. People ask me whether I miss Australia. Of course I do. I miss certain things with ridiculous intensity, proper meat pies, walking into a hardware store and knowing exactly where everything is. Cold winter mornings, the sound of Australian birds, my children, my grandchildren. I miss being able to see them without crossing an ocean. There is no cheap way around that truth. Living abroad means somebody you love is always far away. Technology helps, but a video call is not a hug. I have flown back for weddings, birthdays, and once for a funeral I wish I had not needed to attend. Every time I land in Australia, something inside me relaxes because everything is familiar. And then after a week or 2, something else happens. I start feeling like a visitor. That shocked me the first time. The streets are familiar, the accents are familiar, the food is familiar, but my life is not there anymore. My life is here. That is the part people misunderstand when I say I will never return to Australia. I'm not rejecting Australia. Australia gave me almost everything important in my first life. It gave me my career, my marriage, my children, my oldest friends. It gave me Margaret. How could I hate a place that gave me Margaret? But there is a difference between loving where you came from and knowing where you belong now. I learned that late, very late. If Margaret had lived, would we have moved here together? I think about that more than I should. Probably not. She liked her routines. She liked her garden. She liked knowing where Christmas would be every year. Maybe she would have come for a holiday and told me the humidity was ruining her hair. That thought still makes me smile. Sometimes I feel guilty that the life I built after she died became a good life. Widowers do not always talk about that. There is a strange loyalty to sadness. You think if you become happy again, even in some quieter, older version of happiness, you are leaving the person behind. For years, I kept Margaret's photograph beside my bed. I still have it, but now it sits on a shelf in the living room. That change took me nearly 7 years. Nobody told me to move it. I just realized one morning that I was no longer waking up into the life that ended. I was waking up into the life I had. There is a difference. 11 years have passed since I arrived. 11 years. I came here at 61 with 2 suitcases and the private suspicion that I had made the biggest mistake of my life. I am 72 now. My hair is thinner. My knees complain. I take more tablets than I used to. I have had a few health scares that reminded me very clearly that I am not 30. I am not pretending I will live forever. That is exactly why I am staying. I have a doctor I trust. I have neighbors who know me. I have routines. I have a little place where the morning light comes through the front windows at an angle that I notice every single day. On Wednesdays, I meet 2 friends for coffee. On Fridays, I usually have dinner with Ernesto's family. Some Sundays, I call my children early because of the time difference. Then I walk to a nearby place for breakfast. It is not exciting, that is the joke. I did not move halfway around the world to have an exciting retirement. I moved because I was afraid my life had become too small. What I found was not adventure, it was ordinary life again. A shopkeeper who knows my order, a neighbor who borrows tools and forgets to return them, rain on a metal roof, a child waving at me from across the road. Somebody calling my name when I walk into a room. Those things sound small until you have lived without them. People ask, but what happens when you get older? What if you need help? What if your health gets worse? Fair questions. I ask them too. I keep plans. I keep money aside. My children know where my documents are. We talk about the future more openly now than we did 10 years ago. Maybe life will force another decision on me one day. Life has done that before. But if you are asking me what I want, sitting here at 72 with the fog lifting outside and my coffee going cold in my hands, the answer is simple. I want to stay. I do not want to return to Australia to wait for the end in a place that used to be home just because that is what people expect an old Australian man to do. I have already had one life end. I was there when it happened. This one is still going. And tomorrow morning, if I am lucky, I will wake before the sun, hear that ridiculous rooster, smell garlic from next door, and watch the fog settle over the ridge. 11 years ago, I thought that view belonged to somebody else's life. Now I know better. It belongs to mine.